In these difficult times, as we sit helplessly by and watch the world slip slowly down around our ankles, it's comforting to realize that no matter how great the crisis, the United States always has its ultimate instrument of diplomacy to rely on, and that is the United States Marines. Here's a song about that. When someone makes a move of which we don't approve, who is it that always intervenes? UN and OAS, they have their place, I guess. But first, send the Marines. We'll send them all we've got. John Wayne and Randolph Scott. Remember those exciting fighting scenes? To the shores of Tripoli, but not to Mississippi. What do? We send the Marines. For might makes right. Until they've seen the light, they've got to be protected, all their rights respected, till somebody we like can be elected. Members of the Corps all hate the thought of war. They'd rather kill them off by peaceful means. Stop calling it aggression. Ooh, we hate that expression. We only want the world to know that we support the status quo. They love us everywhere we go. So when in doubt, send the Marines. I'd like to dedicate that song to President Johnson, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight.
My name is Ben Burgess, and this is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. The voice and piano you just heard was from Tom Lehrer, mathematician, professor, songwriter, singer, whose peak of popularity was about 60 years ago. I think he gave up making new music something like 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah, he stopped performing live in 72, still recorded music through the 70s, mostly for like educational stuff.
Yeah. So I think he decided to, put down his piano and, focus on math and, I don't know, just being a person. I think he decided he'd said what he had to say, but those songs.
Well, actually, he did have a quote that is perfect for the show. He said that satire was dead after Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize.
That is perfect. Actually, I'm glad you threw that in there. So yeah, all satirists really should have done the honorable thing and retired when that happened. But yeah, certainly the songs he created in the 60s, the 70s, obviously that's all before I was born, but, God, I remember I used to have like an actual cassette tape of Tom Lehrer songs and stuff like that, Send in the Marines, or We'll All Go Together When We Go, which is a fun little ditty about how at least when World War III happens, there'll be nobody left to be sad that we're gone. Or the Smut song, which really would have been appropriate for tonight because, talk about John Stuart Mill, who's the great champion of free speech. I've all really enjoyed those over the years. My mom was always a big fan of Hanukkah in Santa Monica. So it's a Tom Lehrer song. But in any case, he passed away over the weekend at the age of 97. So thought we would start with that tribute. And yeah, the main show tonight is going to be Matt McManus and Norman Finkelstein together at last, talking. They've both been, well, Norm's been on the show several times, Matt's been on the show a million times, so makes some sense. But in any case, I realized a little while ago that they both have an interest in John Stuart Mill. In fact, I think we have a clip from a little class or lecture that Norm did about John Stuart Mill at Communist Party of Great Britain educational event where I think passions end up rising in the discussion section.
Now you have one class of one course, and you're reacting like something has been horrifically imposed upon you. It's one peak of dissent amidst a chorus of grand Russian-style choir of political correctness. We're talking about one class, and you're already bridling at the idea how horrible it is, how I'm feeling oppressed. It's one class hearing a different point of view.
But what's a compulsory class with no right to reply or challenge? That's the point.
You have, comrade, you have your mind. You can challenge whoever you like. Nobody's forcing you to believe anything. It's simply getting you to think. You then leave class. If you feel strongly about it, you go and research. You go and ask. You go and talk. Nobody's hurting you. The only memorable class I had in college in 4 years, the only memorable class I had in 4 years in college was Morris Watnick. He taught Marxism. He was all the way on the far right. He was a brilliant man, marvelously eloquent, and very persuasive. And each day I sat in the class so deeply shattered and crushed. And the first thing I did after class is I ran to the student union to talk with their elder comrades about why he's wrong. It didn't stop me from thinking. It incited me to think. In fact, 40 years later, it's the only class I remember. But it's true.
Yeah. So before we get to all that, in fact, before we even get to the opening argument, a few things that I wanted to mention. First, on Saturday, August 16th, Megan Day and I are doing an in-person event in Los Angeles where we will be chatting with Pelle Dragsted, who is a Danish parliamentarian and the author of a really interesting book called Nordic Socialism. That event is free and open to everybody. It's going to be at the Village Well bookstore in Culver City. Again, that's August 16th at 6 p.m. One thing I would note, if you are planning to come, is that if you're, if you're thinking about buying the book beforehand, honestly, it'd be better for us if instead of just ordering it from Amazon or whatever and reading it before the event, you waited and bought it at the bookstore, because it's going to be better for us if the bookstore gets the idea that they can move some copies when we do this stuff there. So that's one thing. Second,
or you could buy two. Buy one from Amazon to read it beforehand, and then buy a second one at the event. Get it signed. Keep that on your bookshelf, and give the other one away to somebody who needs to read that book.
Yeah, that works too. So speaking of books, I know a while back I mentioned to start doing a Capital Volume 2 class on the GTAA Patron. I'd done a Volume 1 class on the Patreon that ended a little while ago, and right now, with the students from that class, I've been sort of slowly reading this document that Marx wrote called The Results of the Immediate Process of Production, or sometimes the Resultate for short, that some editions include as an appendix to Volume 1, and it's taking us a little longer to get through that thing than I've been hoping, which is why the Volume 2 class hasn't started yet. But I think I can firmly commit to starting the Volume 2 class on Labor Day weekend. I think between finishing up the Resultate and a little bit of planned family stuff that's going to get in the way for a couple Sundays. After that, I think we should still be good for a Labor Day weekend starting date. So that class meets on Sunday afternoons, Eastern time, or late mornings here on the West Coast. So that's 1 to 3 New York or 10 to noon Los Angeles. That's kind of the time I've settled on over the years for stuff like this, because It's not too early if you live where I live, and it's not too late in the evening if you live in Europe. So it accommodates kind of as many time zones as possible. If you miss it, you can, catch the recording later, of course. But, for doing it live, it accommodates as many time zones as we can. If you're in Tokyo, maybe you're out of luck, but, as much as we can. And, if you are already in the club of people who've gone through volume 1, but you've never tried to do volume 2, this might be a good way to get through it. Just, sign up on the Patreon. When I first started teaching the first version of the Capital Volume 1 class, I was doing it through Michael Albert's thing, the School for Social and Cultural Change. And they had a sliding scale based on income. So when that school shut down and I had to move it to the Patreon, I just set the price for the Patreon tier at the monthly version of where SSCC had their low income tier for the 2-month classes. That just seemed like the easiest solution. This does take up a lot of time, right? We are still living in a money-based economy, comrades. But, that seemed like kind of the best compromise. But if you absolutely can't even afford that, just let me know and we can figure something out. Oh, and I'm still doing the totally free in-person volume 1 class in Los Angeles. Every once in a while, people message me to ask if it's okay if they join up halfway through. The answer is always yes. Anyone's free to join whenever. Right now, we're doing chapter 15, which would actually be a fascinating place to come in. That's Marx's chapter on technology. But in any case, that one meets on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. at Cafe Mach in Koreatown in Los Angeles. And while we're doing basic housekeeping stuff, is that tonight, instead of doing a regular post game, we're going to do a special patron exclusive cross stream with This Is Revolution. For patrons of both shows, hosted by TIR. So Jason, who anybody who's watching this, at all regularly, probably knows is the host of This Is Revolution, asked if I had anything planned for tonight. I said I did, but, we could do it as, in the post-game time slot. And he asked if I wanted to do a stream with him to talk about Hulk Hogan and Ozzy Osbourne, and that sounded good to me. I actually wrote something about the Hulkster for MSNBC that was all about how as much childhood nostalgia as I have for WWF, and yes, that's WWF nostalgia, not WWE nostalgia. I am very old. Looking back at the peak of Hogan's popularity, was kind of the ultimate symbol of the dumbest, most USA kind of late Cold War, Reagan era, jingoism and hysteria about foreigners. So that's kind of what that article is about. And, I haven't written anything about Ozzy because nobody's asked me to. If you're watching and you own a magazine and you want to commission me to write that article, I will 100% do it. But I certainly have stuff to say. Always been a huge fan of Ozzy era Sabbath and gotten a lot of joy out of the solo albums over the years. And I've actually been re-listening to the first few solo albums a bunch since he passed. So we're going to do that with TIR instead of a regular post game tonight. If you are a patron of this show, you should get the link to that around halfway through the main show. The same time you'd usually get a post game link. And if you're not a patron, no time like the present to get your life together and become one. Get right with us. But Jake, Andy, either of you guys have anything that you need to announce before we go to the opening argument?
Do you have anything, Andy?
No, not really. Just seeing shows and hopefully see you guys at Teen Driver next month.
All right, sounds good. Well, when we get closer, remind people where that is.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's do it.
Oh wait, we have the Ben's song first.
Gotta be streaming.
Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're gonna show us how to argue it. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point. Bret Stephens is a New York Times columnist. He's their House conservative, and he may be best remembered for trying to get a college professor fired for jokingly referring to him as a bedbug on social media. But I have a feeling that future generations might now remember him for something else entirely. Israel's genocide in Gaza has reached a grim new stage where the kind of images of shriveled husks of starved babies, of gaunt old women stumbling around like, Musselmänner at Auschwitz have deeply disturbed even some commentators who previously could tell themselves comforting lies about human shields and collateral damage and a few bad apples committing war crimes until now. I'm not going to show you any of those images on screen while we're talking about it, because frankly, using them to illustrate anything I'm saying in a podcast doesn't feel right to me, but it's very easy to find what I'm talking about if you look, and maybe even if you don't. Back in 2023 and 2024, I was writing a lot of articles all the time and doing debates about the horrors that Israel was perpetrating in Gaza, and I could still bracket it all fairly well. Channel my outrage into the writing and usually get myself to stop thinking about it during a lot of the rest of the day. But now it's been hard to keep those images out of my head. And I suspect that I'm not at all alone in that experience. This kind of deliberate, calculated policy of mass starvation as a weapon of war has shaken even a lot of observers who seem to have been able to rationalize everything up until this point. And it's just one component of this cavalcade of horror that, I've seen in some of the recent developments shake even some people on the right. When the IDF bombed the only Catholic church in Gaza, they said it was an accident, which they do sometimes when people get too mad at them, but it's not the 1st or 10th or 20th house of worship they bombed. And you had the publisher of the Babylon Bee say, well, there are only a couple hundred Catholics in Gaza. And anyway, they're all Hamas supporters, he said, which I guess makes it okay to kill or dismember them in his worldview if they support Hamas. I saw even a lot of right-wing people get off the bus. And as mass starvation reached its peak, and now they say they're going to back off and let in some more aid. We'll see how exactly all this plays out in the coming weeks. But we've been seeing, for example, that even the leading human rights organizations in Israel are now saying it's a genocide. We've got the Haaretz article about this, I believe. But basically, B'Tselem is saying that's the main Israeli human rights organization, and Physicians for Human Rights is the other one. Amnesty International got there a long time ago. Human Rights Watch got there a long time ago. The 14 countries, including the one that I'm located in right now, Mexico, that joined the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, got there a long time ago. Anti-Semitism, I'm sure that Claudia Scheinbaum supports that. The ICG itself said a very long time ago that Israel was at least at risk of committing genocide in Gaza if it didn't pull back from the brink. I think Ehud Olmert, who used to be the Israeli prime minister, held back from using the G word, but he used a near synonym. He said what Netanyahu is doing is unforgivable, and he called it something like a war of annihilation. But last Tuesday, Bret Stephens used his little New York Times column to say, no, that's all nonsense. There's no genocide in Gaza. So here's how he starts the article. I'll just do this as a screen share. He says, it may seem harsh to say, but there is a glaring dissonance to the charge that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. To wit, if the Israeli government's intention and actions are truly genocidal, if it is so malevolent that it is committed to the annihilation of Gazans, why hasn't it been more methodical and vastly more deadly? Why not say hundreds of thousands of deaths, as opposed to the nearly 60,000 that Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry, which does not distinguish between combatant and civilian deaths, has cited so far in nearly 2 years of war. First things first, calling the Gaza Ministry of Health Hamas-run is obscenely stupid. Like if I called HHS numbers on, the rate of heart attacks last year, the year before, numbers from the GOP-run Department of Health and Human Services. These aren't political operatives. These are, Hamas or otherwise. These are doctors and medical bureaucrats. They're scrupulously careful. That's why they don't even offer estimates of how many of the bodies they count are civilians versus combatants because they're so careful about not going beyond what they could say for sure. And after every previous Israeli war in Gaza, the Ministry of Health numbers always turned out to be pretty accurate. They were never cooking the books before. And even the Israelis have used those numbers sometimes. Second, even before the starvation reached the point of absolute catastrophe it has in recent weeks, there were absolutely already hundreds of thousands of deaths in Gaza because of Israel's actions. Those 60,000 are direct deaths. And since the health ministry is so scrupulous, they only count bodies they've actually seen who were directly killed by the Israeli military. The indirect effects of the total systematic planned annihilation of all medical infrastructure, all infrastructure of any kind that it takes to support normal life in Gaza, certainly producing food, has absolutely taken hundreds of thousands of lives already. I'm not saying the food specifically. I think, the starvation deaths right now, it's still in the low three figures, but that I know of. But there is no way realistically that the overall toll isn't at this point in the hundreds of thousands. Certainly credible estimates like a letter published in the Lancet last year already put it in that territory. Second, philosophy professor Sam Badger, whose Substack I'm a big fan of, by the way. You should check it out. It's sambadger.substack.com. He has a good essay on this called Bad Arguments Against Genocide Claims. And the second argument he covers is, quote, more people could be killed than are being killed, meaning that it's not a genocide. So, for example, Stephens doesn't use this particular flourish, but a point I've seen a lot of people make who are trying to, make the same case as him, right? That, well, if the goal is annihilation, why not kill a lot more people a lot more quickly and efficiently? They'll say, well, look, Israel has nukes. They could just nuke Gaza. And Sam patiently explains that this argument, quote, ignores the fact that there are many other sensible reasons why not to not drop a nuclear weapon. Your own people might live downwind of any fallout. You might want to use the land now emptied of people. You might be busy doing some kind of bullshit diplomatic kabuki dance where you pretend not to have any atomic weapons, even if everyone already knows you do, just hypothetically. And getting back to the larger argument that Bret Stephens does make, since Israel isn't killing as many people as possible, as quickly and efficiently as possible, with zero other considerations to balance against jacking up the death count as high as they can, therefore there's no genocide to see here. Sam makes, I think, a really quietly devastating point, which is that this argument, and I quote, suggests that there's some relative rate at which we can definitely state that someone is guilty. Does one need to kill as many individuals from the group as they possibly can to commit genocide? This would rule out all existing genocides, as every historical genocide could have been committed faster. The fact that the Nazis could have killed their Jewish slaves right away instead of forcing them to make V2 rockets, thereby lowering their relative bodies per day, doesn't mean that they weren't committing genocide. I think we can all recognize how obscene it would be to deny that the show was a genocide because it could have been done faster. I'd add that unlike the show, which was of course committed by the Nazis in secrecy, lots of people knew, but they were doing their best to cover their tracks as well as they could. This one is being live streamed. That's a grim new bridge that we've crossed as a species. And that one does impose some limits on how it's carried out. Israel does have to worry about how many people they kill in which ways, because they worry about what their imperial patron will stomach. They don't want that supply of money and weapons to stop. They don't want Uncle Sam to lift the absolute diplomatic cover so they can commit these crimes without becoming a totally diplomatically and economically isolated rogue state no one will trade with, subject to sanctions or subject to other consequences by the rest of the world. So they've got competing imperatives. They do want to get rid of the Palestinian population of Gaza, but they also don't want any of those consequences to happen for them. So they're trying to kill as many as they can get away with, but they're not always sure what they can get away with. Netanyahu is constantly testing and prodding and seeing where the line is. We've seen that over and over and over again. That absolutely does not mean it's not a genocide, either in the common sense meaning of genocide or is strictly defined in international law. We'll get back to that. Meanwhile, Stephens continues, It is not that Israel lacks the capacity to have meted out a vastly greater destruction than it has inflicted so far. It is the leading military power in the region, stronger now that it has decimated Hezbollah and humbled Iran. It could have bombed without prior notice, instead of routinely warning Gazans to evacuate areas it intended to strike. It could have bombed without putting its own soldiers, hundreds of whom have died in combat, risk. And I really want to take a beat to talk about the kind of behavior here that Stephens is celebrating. Israel will send out cell phone alerts, like something out of a dystopian movie, or Squid Games or something, that you have, a minute, 2 minutes, that you have to get out right now as fast as you can so it can wash its hands of whatever happens later, even though as early as late 2023, the infrastructure for charging cell phones was already getting dicey for a lot of people, the victims, and Palestinian civilians were routinely killed by the IDF while walking around with their phones up hills trying to get a signal. And of course, what Stephens is celebrating is constantly moving around civilians, including lots of people with medical conditions or a hard time moving around, basically doing high-tech forced marches of starving people from one end of the tiny strip of land in which they're imprisoned to another, in a calculated attempt to make their lives as unbearable as possible. So at the end of the process, the survivors will accept, quote unquote, voluntary transfer out of the country entirely. And this is not me speculating. Netanyahu says out loud that that's the Trump post-war plan. We're going to do the Trump plan, he said, voluntary mass transfer. So Stephens writes, it isn't that Israel has been deterred from striking harder by the presence of the hostages in Gaza. Israeli intelligence is said to have a fairly good idea of where the hostages are being held, which is one reason, with tragic exceptions, relatively few have died from Israeli fire. And it knows that as brutal as the hostages' captivity has been, Hamas has an interest in keeping them alive. The most amazing part of this paragraph to me is that breezy little phrase, with tragic exceptions. By the end of 2024, there were already dozens of hostages that have been killed by the IDF, and that's out of only a couple hundred in total that were taken on October 7th. This would be a huge percentage of the total number, even if the full number had been in captivity the whole time. But of course, that's not even close to being true, right? Some were rescued, lots and lots were released in various temporary, ceasefire deals. And, by the way, at any time in the nearly 2 years this has been going on, every single hostage could have been released as part of a permanent ceasefire deal. The one and only reason this hasn't happened is that the Israelis have never been willing to contemplate a permanent ceasefire, only a temporary pause, and Hamas has only been willing to release some hostages, not all of them, for obvious reasons, as long as the war has been going on. And while we're talking about the hostages, it's worth noting that a few things can all be true at once. First, fuck Hamas. I've never had any truck with Hamas apologism, and I never will. Taking civilian hostages is obviously a war crime, even if compared to the scale of Israel's subsequent war crimes, it's barely a drop or two of water in an ocean of horror. But nevertheless, it's a war crime. And, as is, by the way, the mass hostage taking by retaliation by the IDF, if we're going to apply the same terminology to the same behavior. And, the sexual abuse of a lot of those hostages at Sde Taiman, with lots of Israeli commentators openly cheering what was happening to them and all of that. But second, at this point, my understanding is the remaining civilian hostages who weren't killed in Israeli strikes have long since been released anyway. I think the few dozen remaining hostages are all military, which, is important to keep in mind to get a realistic image of what we're still talking about here. And finally, again, Netanyahu could get every single one released tomorrow if that was his priority. It never has been. Anyway, back to Bret Stephens. Most of the hostages killed by the Israeli military were in airstrikes, but some who'd already escaped were literally waving white flags, a few of them, and were actually shot by Israeli soldiers who thought they were shooting Palestinians. Look that up. That happened. Right? It's because they were wearing burqas, they've been put on them while they're being moved around. Next, Stephens writes, nor is it that Israel lacks diplomatic cover. President Trump has openly envisaged requiring all Gazans to leave the territory, repeatedly warning that all hell would break out in Gaza if Hamas didn't return the hostages. And of course, the U.S. is the only country in the world. As for the threat of economic boycotts, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has been the world's best performing major stock index since October 7th, 2023. With due respect to the risk of Irish boycotts, Israel is not a country facing a fundamental economic threat. If anything, it is the boycotters who stand to suffer. In short, the first question the anti-Israel genocide chorus needs to answer is, why isn't the death count higher? It shouldn't take more than 5 seconds of thought here to see that what's wrong with Stephens' argument. Yes, Israel right now has kept just on the right line of the kind of thing that, of triggering devastating economic boycotts and sanctions, given its relationship with the U.S. and given that, even in places like France, never mind Arab countries, governments have to deal with public outrage about this. But they have they have managed to avoid that so far. Now, why it's supposed to follow from them avoiding that so far, that if they go too far too fast, they might not be able to avoid it, is a mystery to me. I mean, I really don't understand this argument. In fact, the facts Stephens is pointing to undermine his case on this point. Israel has so far escaped economic consequences. Well, Netanyahu obviously wants to keep things that way. So yes, that does give him a reason not to kill as many as quickly as he might have otherwise. That does not mean he's not trying to cause every inch of death and destruction to this population that he thinks he can get away with. Having rejected the obvious answer to his rhetorical question about why Israel isn't finishing the job more quickly and efficiently on obviously spurious grounds, Stephens continues. The answer, of course, is that Israel is manifestly not committing genocide. A legally specific and morally freighted term that is defined by the United Nations Convention on Genocide as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Note the words intent and as such. Genocide does not mean simply too many civilian deaths, a heartbreaking fact of nearly every war, including the one in Gaza. So a few points about this. First, that loathsomely breezy little hand-waving reference to too many civilian deaths being a heartbreaking fact of nearly every war. You can just feel Bret's heart breaking while he's writing that, right? It's not designed to invite people to actually think about the comparisons to other wars. It's designed to get them to not think about it. But here's the reality. Gaza only had a pre-war population, even according to the highest estimates I've seen, of about 2.3 or 2.4 million people. Compare that to, say, Ukraine, which had a pre-war population of 40 million people, maybe more like 44 million in 2022. Or even Iraq, which before the US invaded in 2003 had a pre-war population of about 26 million people. But not even taking into account indirect deaths, within a matter of months after October 7th, certainly less than a year, Israel had killed more Palestinian civilians in Gaza, according to even the lowest estimates, than Russia had killed in 3 years in Ukraine. And that's 3 years of a bombing campaign that was widely and correctly condemned for violations of the laws of war. Certainly, Israel had killed way more Gazans than the US did Iraqis in 2003. And I'm not talking relative to its tiny population. I'm talking about absolute numbers. Second, since Bedbug Bret brings up the UN convention that defines genocide, let's take a look, shall we? Here's Article 1. Says the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or time of war, and I just want to stop there to note that it's not genocide, it's war, is a legal non sequitur. The first fucking thing the UN Convention says when defining genocide is that it does not matter whether it's taking place during a war or not. Sometimes idiots say that, in a real genocide, the killing would start after the other side surrendered, but in fact, a lot of genocides have taken place during wars. That's more the rule than the exception. Anyway, it goes on to say that this is a crime all contracting powers are duty-bound to prevent, which obviously became a bad joke. But Article 2 is really where you get the definition of just what the crime is. Bret quotes the intention to destroy in a whole or in part bit. We'll get back to intent. But I just want to note that there's a whole list of acts here which, done in pursuit of this goal, count as genocidal. And killing members of the group is just the first one. The second one is causing serious bodily harm. Think about the long-term organ damage from starvation. Even a lot of Gazans who get food now are going to suffer. And the third, item C in that list is about overall conditions of life, right? That inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, or in whole or in part. And that's the point. Netanyahu's whole goal the last couple of years has been to inflict conditions of life on Gaza that will kill part of the group, immiserate the rest, and generally make normal life impossible, so the survivors will accept so-called voluntary transfer. And I'm sorry, but seeking deliberate calculated mass death with the intention of inducing everybody else to leave, right, to displace an entire ethnic group from a territory, is, even if your goal isn't to kill every single one individual, that is still absolutely textbook genocide, given the UN definition. Bret isn't persuaded, though, so let's see what he has to say. So yeah, let's lose the graphic. He says, by contrast, the fact that over 1 million German civilians died in World War II, thousands of them in appalling bombings of cities like Hamburg and Dresden, made them victims of war, but not of genocide. The aim of the Allies was to defeat the Nazis for leading Germany into war, not to wipe out the Germans simply for being German. Right, but as I recall from the history books, we didn't have FDR or Harry Truman or General Eisenhower saying that the goal was a Germany that would be emptied of Germans, right? That they would, that we were going to, have a Germany where all the ethnic Germans would leave. Netanyahu and his cabinet ministers are quite open about that goal. And, by the way, appalling barely covers it. Dresden has long since been acknowledged, I thought, both by international legal scholars and any normie who's read Slaughterhouse-Five, to be a really appalling war crime. So it's not exactly a comforting analogy here. In fact, the laws of war we have now for the Second Geneva Convention, weren't even written yet when this was happening, which is why even on the Allied side of the war, you have lots and lots of actions that would count as war crimes by modern definition. See Hiroshima. When you have to go back to before the current laws of war were even codified to find an analogy to, put what you're doing in a slightly less grisly light, that's a very bad sign. But while we're at it, as bad as the bombing of German civilians were, actually, if you just Google German civilians killed in World War II and German soldiers killed in World War II, a lot more dead soldiers than dead civilians, which is a pretty relevant disanalogy with Gaza. The total estimated number of Hamas fighters in 2023, I've never seen an estimate that was higher than 30,000 people. And those 30,000, by and large, it's been safer to be one of them than to be an unarmed civilian during the last 2 years of horror. Nobody believes the 60,000 directly killed and, the ones whose bodies were found and identified by the Ministry of Health and counted towards the number is mostly Hamas fighters. If they literally killed every single one of them, it would be about half Hamas fighters, but I don't think anybody believes that. For one thing, it would be very hard to explain why the war was still going on if that were true. I could go on and do every line of the rest of Bret's article, but that would take all night and I would just depress myself. So I think I'm going to leave it at this. I strongly suspect that a column published in the paper of record at the time the Gaza genocide entered its grimmest phase in 2 years, at the time when even Israeli human rights organizations were starting to label it as a genocide, right? A column at that time with the actual title, "No, Israel isn't committing genocide in Gaza," is something people are going to remember for a long, long time. I have a hard time imagining that our descendants won't have a unit in their world history classes about Gaza. And I have to say, I doubt any textbook would leave out this image.
Oh, wait, we have the, okay, Ben's song first.
Gotta restrain me.
Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue it. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point. All right. So I see Matt in the waiting room. I think there was a little bit of, so let me make sure. I'm actually going to duck off for a second after we bring Matt on, so I can make sure, Norm, got the link. But meanwhile, we have Matthew motherfucking McManus, author of many, many things. Most recently, a book about liberal socialism. And sorry, cat is trying to maneuver himself in between me and the screen in classic cat style. So in any case, he is one half of the duo who is here to talk to us about John Stuart Mill. I am going to make sure that the other half is on his way right now. I will see you guys back here in
Matt, we actually can't we can't hear you, so we can use this time productively to make sure we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. So how were you a Tom Lehrer fan?
Tom Lehrer fan? No, I don't even know who Tom Lehrer is.
Tom Lehrer? He passed away over this weekend. We started the show with him.
Oh, no, sorry, I don't.
Okay. Fair enough.
Matt and I are too young.
Yeah. I guess
I was sad about Ozzy dying. That was my most recent heartbreak, but
yeah, no, I mean Tom Lehrer was 97, was basically a satirist that we probably wouldn't have like Weird Al if it wasn't for him. Mainstay of the Dr. Demento show. His satire was just like slightly cleverer than I think a lot of people who followed. And doing really short songs too. I mean, I don't know how much Jake dove into it today.
No, there was a real economy of wit there.
Nice.
But by the way, Matt, did you? I don't know what's up. What's up, Ben? Are we killing time, or are we?
He's
time.
muted.
Our time. Yeah.
He's still muted.
I mean,
yeah.
this is supposed to be on John Stuart Mill's and freedom of speech, Ben. So it's probably not good that you mute and censor yourself, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. By the end of the episode, I'll understand why I'm not supposed to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I had to take myself off camera for a moment and mute and all that, so I could call Norm. He's the last man in America with a landline phone, so there's no texting. There's no texting Professor Finkelstein, but he has got the message. So with any luck, he should be with us in just a moment.
Only person without a phone to have appeared on StreamYard. I feel like
Yes.
there's like a big technological gap. We could play the Matt. You probably missed the clip we played earlier. We could play that for folks who missed it. Or I don't know, Ben, if you want to, you could just get started talking a little Mills. It just comrade, you have your mind is I'm gonna have to use that from Norm. I want to know who Norm was fighting, like who he was debating. It sounded like the most British person possible in the clip that we played earlier. So maybe Norm could give some context. But where do we go from here, Ben? You gonna dive into some Mills?
Yeah, we could probably dive into a bit of Mill. Yeah, so the clip we played earlier was from Norm giving a lecture on John Stuart Mill's On Liberty at a Communist Party of Great Britain educational event. And,
I was watching that not too long ago.
Yeah. So there's a point where one of the people at the event, is like, I think they're like mortified at the thought that they would have to, that they were going to listen to something that was offensive in a context where they couldn't, talk back. So it's like they would be forced to believe it. And Norm, in kind of inimitable Norm style, you have your mind, comrade. Right? You can still, nobody's forcing you to think anything. But on that note, I believe we have the man himself backstage. So let's go ahead and bring on Professor Norman Finkelstein, the author of this book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. Heretical Thoughts and Identity, Called Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. How are you doing tonight, Norm?
Same as every other night.
3,000 years of Jewish suffering, nothing new tonight.
Fair enough. So just more of the same. All right.
Just more of the same.
Yeah. I remember when when you were on with Jordan Dubin before the we were talking about your Dershowitz debate and before we went live, you asked her, I asked her, it's like, oh, how are you doing tonight, Jordan? And she was like, oh, can't complain. And you were like, really? Huh. What must that be like? So.
Weird interjection. I fucking was watching Dershowitz debate Meta the other day, and he was bringing up how horrible what the Bush administration did was to Iraq, and was like, we learned some mistakes from that. And I was like, yeah, but Alan, I was there, and I'm old enough to remember that you were the one who was calling for us to make a lot of those fucking mistakes, right? So if anything, you seem to be the worst possible avatar for these kinds of positions. Anyway, I find it baffling that a man who has so little insight into so much has just retained a career in the public for such an extended period of time. I mean, fuck, if I committed a crime, then maybe I'd hire Alan Dershowitz as a lawyer, but that'd be the only thing I could think he'd be useful for.
Yeah. I mean, it is amazing how keep realizing they made mistakes and then committing the same mistake again in the future. But putting aside the unfortunate Mr. Dershowitz, the reason I thought this would be an interesting conversation is that Matt has been on the show many times before. Norm has been on several times before, and I realized recently that the two of you have an interest in common in John Stuart Mill. That there is in this book. There is extensive discussion of Mill. He's in the index many times, which makes sense given the focus on free speech in there. And Matt has written many things about Mill. I think Andy just kind of grabbed a selection of them. That one, so gives you a sense. A lot of that is about Mill's views on political economy and socialism, which also come up in Matt's liberal socialism book. And and I was thinking about this when I was watching a lecture that Norm gave that you can find on YouTube at a Communist Party of Great Britain educational event about Mill. And in particular, I noticed that there was a point in there, Norm, where you said something I've heard Matt say before too, which was that you were sort of talking about Mill, and you were talking about your interest in him as a thinker over the years, and you said that you were disturbed when you realized that Karl Marx in Capital had characterized some of Mill's views unfairly, which I think you said, like, just given how much Marx and Capital has meant to you was kind of an unsettling thing to realize.
Look, first of all, if you read the subsequent issues of Capital after the first edition, there's only one place where Marx acknowledged an error. And the error was in the second or third edition, I don't know which. He said he misrepresented John Stuart Mill's principles of political economy. That is the only place anywhere in Capital where Marx acknowledged the mistake. And I remember Paul Sweezy, the great American Marxist economist. I took a course with him on Capital, the last course he ever taught. And he commented that Mill's Principles of Political Economy was the best presentation of the classical view of economics. He was, in that era, you didn't have this vast proliferation of secondary literature and monographic literature. So these people didn't have to read a lot in any particular field to comment on it. So each of them wrote, someone like Mill will write a outstanding work in political economy, an outstanding work in representative government, and an outstanding work in the subjection of women, on liberty. They went everywhere. And Mill was good. Why Marx did that? It's a puzzle to me. But it's not really a puzzle. You see, it's not really a puzzle. The bottom line was Marx was a revolutionary. Mill was not. And that for them was the great dividing line. I just read a biography just yesterday, completed it, of Charles Sumner, the abolitionist, who was just an extraordinary figure, really breathtaking in his combination of erudition and commitment. I mean, his level of commitment to the cause of Black equality in the United States is just unmatched. And that was acknowledged by people like Frederick Douglass. It was unmatched. And he was not bad in anti-imperialism. When Frederick Douglass was among the leaders of the campaign to annex the Dominican Republic and later Haiti, Sumner was absolutely against it. And he got into a real there was real antagonism between Douglass and him. Douglass was so angry at Sumner. So Sumner was very good. But then I'm thinking to myself, so around 1870, Sumner goes on vacation to Europe because he had been suffering both morally and physically. And everyone's telling him to go on a vacation. And he mentions meeting Thiers, the Prime Minister of France. And he meets him in 1872, I think. Now, this is after the Paris Commune, the massive slaughter of the communards, led by Thiers. You won't find a word in Sumner about that. Nothing. Sumner has extensive collected works, at least his collected speeches and orations run to 15 volumes. I imagine with the letters it would run to hundreds of volumes because those people were prolific letter writers. But when it came to the workers' struggle or anything akin to it, there's nothing there. Now, it's true, as you already mentioned, that Mill did have some essays on socialism. And so there was a sympathy to him with the workers' struggle. But in general, Marx was a revolutionary, Mill was a liberal. Now, you might say, at the end of the day, the history redeemed the liberal vision and did not cast a wonderful verdict on the revolutionary position. Most of the great reforms, enduring great reforms, were the result of liberal undertakings. Now, it's true communists played a role, like in the New Deal, for sure. And they played a big role in establishing what we would call the social safety net in Europe. But that was essentially communists joining what you might call a liberal struggle, like the struggle to organize unions. It didn't get past the organizing of unions. The revolutionary part didn't happen. So you could say history's verdict was, let's say, I'll give you an example from the United States. In the 1960s, you could have done one of two things. You could have joined some radical black organization like the Black Panthers, of which woke people are very enamored. Or you could have been a Nader's Raider, what we called back then, Ralph Nader. The people supporting him were called Nader's Raiders. And then you ask yourself, okay, so Nader was a liberal. He wanted to put limits, constraints on corporations and so forth. But he wasn't for the elimination of private property and everything else that goes along with it. Now, looking back in that era, you can ask yourself a question. Would your time have been better spent, like myself, being a Maoist, advocating the violent overthrow of the government, and engaging in all of these pretty arcane debates about the national question and things like that? Or you could have done what Nader's Raiders did, which is study all the inner workings of how our system functions and figuring out ways to get through legislation, which, if we speak honestly, Ralph Nader probably saved more lives than any single American in American history. That's just a fact, because of the airbags and the seatbelts. There's no single individual who saved more lives. So, and he created, something pretty extraordinary with all the consumer groups, he and his people. So you could say, once again, history's verdict is the liberal point of view is probably, I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying you can make an argument that from a prudential point of view, you would have done more good had you been a Nader's Raider than if you had joined the Black Panthers or the Weather Underground. You did more good. That may be the verdict. I don't know. I ponder it. Whether I'm aware I made major mistakes as a young person, but I wonder, reliving that life, would I have been wiser to be a Nader's Raider? So it's the same thing with Mill and Marx. One was a revolutionary, one was a liberal, in the current vocabulary of a liberal. And they could not see eye to eye. They could not. Marx loathed bourgeois intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, there is I remember one footnote in Capital where Marx, where Marx does soften the judgment a little bit on Mill. He says something about his modern tendencies. Matt, do you remember this?
Yeah, he essentially points out that while Mill has substantial problems in understanding the connection between the realm of distribution and the realm of production, nonetheless, there's no denying that his thought operates at a far higher level than that of a vulgar bourgeois economist, essentially, which is a judgment that he usually passes on bourgeois economists from whom he thinks he has something to learn, and he thought were intellectually honest rather than just defenders of class society. Get the same kind of evaluation of Ricardo, Adam Smith, etc. But that's one judgment he has that's a little bit more mature. As Professor Finkelstein was pointing out, there are other instances where he's in a bit more of a tart move, and he'll characterize Mill as just the highest echelon of what bourgeois thought is capable, which just goes to show you how low the bar really is. It was Marx.
Yeah, well, so I guess I would be curious. I do want to move to the on liberty stuff relatively soon. But while we're on this, I mean, Matt, since you have written so extensively about this, I mean, Norman kind of characterized this in terms of Mill being a liberal, not just in the sort of broad philosophical sense of liberalism, but like a liberal as opposed to being a radical militant. And there's clearly a sense in which that's right. But he did have these socialist inclinations, especially later in life. So, I mean, and I know, again, you're somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about this, right? So where did Mill end up kind of landing on political economy?
Sure. Well, we're very lucky that he actually lays out expressly how he undertook his conversion in his biography, right? And I want to point out that that's quite rare, right? You don't normally get an intellectual who writes a major book about their life, basically saying, here's all the points where I changed my mind and here's why, right? It clarifies an awful lot. So I just wanted to start out by saying I agree with what Professor Finkelstein said about the kind of choice that a lot of people certainly thought that they faced for a long period of time, including myself when I first encountered Mill and Marx in undergrad. Right? I had essentially been taught that Mill was the kind of arch liberal in the sense of the arch neoliberal. Right? He founded utilitarian theory or utilitarian economics. This had evolved into neoclassical economics, and you had to kind of choose between adopting a more revolutionary socialist perspective or getting along with the reformist who would endorse Bill Clinton or someone like that. And I think that recent scholarship has shown pretty convincingly that Quam Mill's own comment in his biography that he was a socialist, that actually he did take that commitment pretty seriously, certainly by the end of his life. So what he points out in the biography is that he had always been interested in Sassamonianism, Owenism, and other strands of what we might call utopian socialism. He didn't really have a lot of respect for Owen, but he did have a lot of respect for the Sassamonians, which makes sense given that they were the more elitist version of socialism out there. And Helen McCabe points out in her book, John Stuart Mill, Socialist, that he was aware of Marx's existence. He had some positive things to say about articles Marx had written for the International Working Men's Association, although whether he was aware of Marx's existence as an independent writer is something that we probably will never know, right? But in terms of the kind of socialism that he comes around to endorsing, he's very clear that even though he considers himself under the general designation of socialist, that he's not particularly pleased with how socialist intellectuals have represented themselves thus far, with, again, the one exception that I mentioned. And he writes a few different essays on this, and there's also later editions of the Principles of Political Economy, which, as Gary Dorian points out, each edition of that was more socialist than the last. And there are kind of two main tenets to it. The first one is commitment to a kind of market socialism, as we might call it right now, right? So worker cooperatives would be the primary economic engine of production. They'd be managed more or less democratically. And Mill thinks they'd be more efficient than capitalist firms. And he also thinks they'd be more moral than capitalist firms, because he says if you're a liberal, you shouldn't really agree with this idea that we should bow and scrape to aristocrats. And by extension, you also shouldn't think that workers should bow and scrape towards capitalists, right? There was almost a kind of macho quality to this, but I find kind of cute given how nerdy Mill fundamentally was. And then the second dimension to it, on top of this essentially cooperative vision of socialism, was a commitment to, by the time, quite a generous welfare state that would provision things like education, sanitation, basic health services, etc. He didn't go quite as far as people like, say, Thomas Paine, and arguing that there'd be something like a jobs guarantee, but I don't think he'd be opposed to the idea. And taken together, he saw this as expressing his commitment to a kind of socialism where workers would own the means of production and the state would play an ameliorative role in people's lives. And I think it's an attractive enough vision, but I've been very overt on my own writings about pointing out that it's not the vision, for instance, I would get behind in terms of the kind of liberal socialism I would want to sign off on.
Well, so let's just follow up on that last point. I mean, what's the, what's the big element that'd be missing for you?
Well, I mean, I've been pretty overt about the fact that I think that a lot of Marx's criticisms of Mill have a certain amount of cogency to them. I think that, for instance, Marx is wrong to say that Mill is indifferent to relations of production, that he's only concerned with redistribution, right? He thinks that, the laws of production are set by nature, and then you can reproduce the surplus however you want, because he thinks fundamentally you can't disconnect them that way. Mill was somewhat sensitive to that. Like I mentioned, it's not like he sat there and just said, let's have capitalists run things. He said, there is something meaningful about having workers own the means of production. That's what made his thought socialistic, certainly as far as he was concerned. But I do think that there's a little bit of naivete in failing to recognize how it is that capital can leverage things like state power, for example, in order to secure the relations of production that it wants. and that just moralistic argument, of the sort that Mill was very good at, isn't really going to get you very far. Sometimes you need to understand the more nuanced relations of power that emerge from relations of production in the way that Marx did, right? So I think that that's a very serious limitation. The other limitation that I'll point out is, again, I'm a Rawlsian rather than a Millsian when it comes to normative issues, although I like a lot of stuff that Mill puts out. And I think that a better argument for socialism is, again, the way that will secure opportunities and flourishing for the least well-off. We don't want to get into too many of the details about the difference between Mill and Rawls here. But I will say, Mill is broadly a utilitarian in the most progressive sense of the word, right? Where utilitarians understanding human beings as progressive beings, et cetera, et cetera. And he does sometimes make some pretty proto-Rawlsian arguments that I quite like, but in a somewhat different vein. Just to give an example, in his chapters on socialism, he points out, look, I see people defending capitalism 1,000 times a day, usually by appealing to what we would now call the workmanship effort, right? Or ethic, that you should keep the rewards from your labor. And Mill says, well, if we actually took that dictum seriously, the way that the capitalists say we should, then the coal miners and the workers in London would all be stinking rich, and the aristocrats and most of the capitalists would be extremely poor, since it's very clear that the coal miners work a lot harder than the capitalists. And it's also very clear that the capitalists inherit a lot of their money without lifting so much as a finger, right? So again, there's a kind of proto-critique of what we might now call the moral arbitrariness of meritocratic arguments that I like. But, these are theoretical differences.
Okay, so you have some theoretical differences in terms of moral philosophy, and you also have a critique of Mill being perhaps too much of a lib in the sense of not having a theory of state power in the right way. But you see a lot to like in Mill's socialism. That's helpful. So yeah. I do want to, one way maybe of connecting the subjects here is you'd said, and I saw Norm, you're kind of smiling when Matt said this, that one of the interesting things about Mill's autobiography is that it's so rare that major intellectuals will write a book. Well, they just kind of lay out, okay, here's exactly the stuff I got wrong, and here's how I went about changing.
Also very cute on the suffragette point. Long passages about how much he loved his wife. Mill had a very happy marriage, sadly very brief.
Not just how much he loved his wife.
Sorry?
Not just about how much he loved his wife. He went on and on and on.
How smart she was, how great.
How she was incomparable to any other human being that ever existed. I'll say just a few things. It was out of keeping with the rest of the autobiography, which was very well framed. Number two, at the risk of sounding sexist, I did look up a few photos of his wife, and I would say, at least in one category, in her being, there was a distinct deficit. And number three, he says, for example, about the subjection of women, that she deserves most of the credit for the book and how careful she was to review everything. And I'm thinking to myself, but John, then why didn't you have joint ownership of the book?
Yeah, that's true.
You could have just put John Stuart Mill, I forgot her name now.
Harriet Taylor.
Harriet
Taylor.
Harriet Taylor, yeah.
She was married originally, and then he died. And then out of respect for her late husband, they waited, I think it was a year or two, and then they got hitched, and they were together for 7 years. They seemed very happy together, at least according to his account.
She was married, and he was clearly a third wheel in this relationship. And I suspect, this is only, I haven't read the Mill scholarship. I read the autobiography, I think at least 4 times. I just think it's a magnificent book.
Yeah.
It's just there's something about it that's just very appealing. I kept rereading it over the years. I would pick it off the shelf because I think it's only 245 pages, something like that, which tells you something else about Mill. For his accomplishments, it was a very slim volume. He could have gone on for several volumes if he chose to, given his achievements.
Just imagine if William F. Buckley was deciding to write his biography, right?
Right.
It'd be like, Volume 1, my kindergarten years, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the chapter on Harriet Taylor was totally over the top.
Yeah.
Some of my students liked it. I don't know why.
Fair enough.
I always thought, one of the most salient aspects of On Liberty, the first two chapters are basically devoted to freedom of speech, liberty of speech. The last three chapters are on liberty of conduct. And as you know, in those chapters, he makes a plea, not just for individuality, but for eccentricity, which is sort of what you would call over-the-top individuality. You might say eccentricity is making a plea for weirdos. And one of his lines, which my students made a T-shirt for with John Stuart Mill, and then later my colleague, comrade Jamie Stern Miner, and everyone knows my favorite line from Mill's On Liberty is that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. That so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time. And I've always suspected, I could be completely wrong, but because I've not read the Mill literature, the Mill scholarship, I always suspected that was because he must have been severely frowned upon for this relationship with Harriet Taylor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, she was a married woman, and he made it very clear that third wheel is not moving anywhere. They were just waiting for the guy to die, which is a scandal. It's Victorian England, and he's the elite of the elite. So I always thought that relationship colored a lot of what he had to say about things like individuality and eccentricity on Liberty.
Well, yeah, Matt, sir.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, I really love that book also. And I think it's because it's written by a man who is very clearly extremely smart and extraordinarily erudite. Like, he's read everybody. And yet he's not particularly arrogant or grandiose, right? A lot of it is written in a very approachable style, right? He's like, people asked me to write this, including my adopted daughter. So I thought, why not? It's time to kind of collect my thoughts on these things, and I'll put them out there. And he talks a lot about all the people that really made an impact on him, right? He talks about his dad and his complicated relationship, to put it marginally, with him, and meeting Mr. Bentham, and reading Coleridge, and meeting Harriet Taylor, and adopting her daughter afterwards, and his time as a career politician. But what I really like about Mill, and this is, I guess, more tangible, is I mentioned some of the theoretical difficulties that I have with him, right? But by and large, his politics were pretty great on most issues. Sometimes he was even more advanced than Marx on things like women's suffrage and women's issues, for example. Really, the only two that I can criticize him for, a big one is his support for British imperialism, which everyone should be extremely critical of, and I am in my book where I talk about Mill. The second one is actually one that he points out, and even acknowledges in his biography that's a bit odd, is he says, I like to consider myself as being on the advanced end of liberal progressive opinion on every issue, except I couldn't bring myself to do that on the death penalty. And I thought, well, that's so weird, Mill. You yourself seem to be a bit embarrassed by that. Why not? But, on every other issue like abolitionism, women's suffrage, economic democracy, free expression, which we're going to talk about, he was a really, really great guy politically. And I could even add, he gave a toast, as he says in his biography, very proudly, to the revolutions that broke out in France, appreciating the Republic, even though he admitted, while Professor Finkelstein's comments that he was a little bit squeamish about revolution, right? So again, if you're looking for a commentator or a philosopher who got most things right, then Mill, I think, would be pretty close to your guy.
Yeah, I mean, British imperialism is a pretty,
it's a pretty fucking huge one.
It's as asterisks go, right? It's a pretty huge one. But the death penalty thing is interesting. I mean, I think Mill's argument on the death penalty is this utilitarian argument that it's kinder, right? I mean, that you don't get this lifetime of suffering in prison.
Yeah, he might have changed his mind also. He kind of makes a quasi criminological claim also that, we need to deter crime and we need sanctions to deter crime at that point. I think if he had looked at the data now and showed that the death penalty doesn't deter violent crime, he probably would have changed his mind quite some time ago. But, we don't want to speculate too much on what Mill may or may not have thought had he been alive today, since, he wrote about enough to talk about.
Well, let's talk about what we do know that he thought for sure, right? So we're talking about his admissions, and the biography is about autobiography about places where he changed his own mind, and this is not Mill, but this is thematically related. At the beginning of Norm's book, he's got a quote actually from John Stuart Mill's godson, Bertrand Russell. Which I feel a real and solid pleasure when anybody points out a fallacy in any of my views, because I care much less about my opinions than about their being true. And this gets us to the core argument for freedom of speech.
Before you get to it, I want to make one observation striking with me. Yeah. In the autobiography, he predicts with, I thought, remarkable prescience. He said, the one book of mine that will survive is On Liberty.
Yep.
He had a vast corpus. He wrote books, I mentioned already, in philosophy, standard works in philosophy and economics. But he was able to see that of that vast corpus, it would be out On Liberty that would survive. And one of the things that struck me there was...
threatened undergraduates with it to this day, right? If you go to political theory class, you're going to read this whole thing, right? Sorry.
That's correct, especially if you take any course by me.
Yeah.
What struck me is, since we were on the topic of Marx versus Mill, I could very easily imagine Marx reading On Liberty and just completely dismissing it as being devoid of any theoretical depth. It's just a straightforward defense of liberty on grounds which are not complicated. They have no intellectual depth whatsoever. You cannot call On Liberty a work of theory. That's just not correct. He makes very obvious arguments, but he makes them in such a way that it's virtually impossible to coherently answer them. He has you start off with three basic propositions. Proposition number one is, in the opinion not of bad men, but the best of men, nothing that is contrary to truth is useful. So if you take the syllogism, if truth is an absolute value, nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is we're fallible. Human beings are fallible. That is to say, we're not God. What Mill calls the presumption of infallibility. The presumption of infallibility is very interesting. It's one of the only places in On Liberty where Mill uses italics. He's very averse to italics. He thinks the language itself is powerful enough. You don't need boldface. You don't like italics. What is the presumption of infallibility? It is when you decide questions, the truth of questions for others, And he puts for others in italics, meaning the problem is not if you've come to an opinion and you strongly believe it, that's your right. But he says you don't have the right to decide for others what they strongly believe. And therefore, if you have number one, truth is an absolute value. The second step in the syllogism is human fallibility. We make errors. And then the third sentence is the only way you can know something is true is to use his words, a standing invitation to the world to prove you wrong. You have to give everybody the opportunity to prove you wrong before you can have any certainty that what you believe to be true is true. Now, of course, he has many subsidiary arguments, but that's the essence. And the essence you really can't argue with. How can you, if you start off from the assumption that truth is an absolute value, and most people who make any claim to the life of the mind will say, yes, truth is a very important value, if not the most important value. And secondly, we're always capable of making error. Then how can you know truth unless you let everybody criticize you? And I don't think there's, I'm stripping to the bare bones Mill's argument, but I don't think there's an answer to that. I've taught this thing for 20 years, and I always begin the class by saying, let's have a hypothetical. Let's imagine that there are three professors at this college. One is in the history department, one is in the biology department, and one is in the comparative anthropology department. The first professor wants to devote one class of one course in European history, one course in European history, to the proposition that the Nazi Holocaust never happened. The second professor in the biology department teaches genetics and wants to devote one class of the genetics course to the proposition that non-white people are genetically intellectually inferior to white people. And the third course...
Get some very unhappy people attending that class these days.
And the third course is a professor in comparative anthropology who wants to devote one class of one course to the proposition that in some cultures women enjoy being beaten and raped. Okay? Ben Burgess has a very sad look on his face at this moment, I notice.
Well, sure.
So the students say, the students never want to touch the genetic intellectual thing. They don't want to go there. They're very afraid because half of them believe it. The white portion of the class. So they don't want, of course the Nazi Holocaust happened. How can you argue the Nazi Holocaust happened? So I always say, okay, let's just choose a name. Christine. I don't notice that you have, I don't notice a halo over your head. I don't notice, what is it called with an angel? Whatever. I say, are you God? So the student, of course, reacts in horror. What do you mean, am I God? I say, are you God? They say, no. So I said, then you might be wrong, right? Yeah, I could be wrong. Well, then if you might be wrong, maybe the Holocaust denier is right. How do you know? You can't know. You're fallible. You can't know. So you have to first hear his or her arguments and then see if you can answer them. And they really can. I've never had anyone successfully. It's a very basic argument. Now, as I said, the essay is rich. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that essay. but the basic propositions are, in my view, irrefutable. But Mill would say, excuse me, in my opinion, Marx would probably say these are just truisms. There's just no intellectual or theoretical depth in the argument he makes, which I think is probably true. But the argument is still very important.
I mean, if they're truisms, at least they're true. I guess I was thinking about this hypothetical about what Marx might have said about on liberty, and I think I see what you mean about why you think he wouldn't have been into it. I think that I think the one thing that makes me wonder about that is, of course, that Marx himself cut his teeth in the struggle against censorship as the editor of the Neue Schreine Zeitung, right? And actually did, some of his earliest writings are pretty like acidic sort of mockery of justifications for for state censorship. So it's possible that even if there's no great even if the argument's a very simple one, right, that he would that Marx would sort of relish seeing it all laid out in like
I'm doubtful.
In a relatively rigorous way.
The writings you refer to, they're the early Marx.
Yeah.
A couple of articles he wrote on, I think, something having to do with forestry. I can't remember exactly, or woods.
He was concerned that German peasants were once going and collecting wood from the forest because it was the common property of all. And then the capitalists came in, usually the aristocrats became the capitalists, right? And essentially said, no, this is now private property, and you could be censored and fined for taking the wood. And that was a demonstration of how what was once commonly owned by all was now privately owned by some to the detriment of all.
Right, but you will agree that these are just very scattered remarks in the early Marx. They're not really developed. The one person who actually develops them, I think, in a very resonant way was Rosa Luxemburg.
I was just going to say Rosa Luxemburg is like really interested for the Marx and Mill conversation, because as a revolutionary Marxist, in fact, just before she became.
She actually wrote a lot on the subject. It wasn't just a critique of the Russian Revolution.
But the critique of the Russian Revolution is interesting because it is a very on liberty-esque critique, right? Because it's essentially a utilitarian argument that if we're faced with these enormous tasks and building socialism, that that there's no ready-made formula that the party can just know in advance. You need the sort of widest possible discussion among without any views excluded in order to.
As I said, she wrote a lot on the subject. I've studied it. There's now been 5 volumes of her works that have been translated into English. And, I would say there are what you might call practical concerns for Rosa, like the socialist future. We barely know how it's going to work. And so we don't have any blueprint for the future. And we need freewheeling conversation about how to proceed. But it was also for her, she's one of the few of that generation. I found her more convincing. Lenin is not bad in State and Revolution. If you read State and Revolution, one of the remarkable things about this, he never mentions a communist party. There's no mention of a party in State and Revolution because he's writing in the midst of the revolution. If you remember, State and Revolution ends with Lenin saying, there's only one thing more interesting than writing about revolution, and he says that's living it. And so I can't finish this book because we're in the middle of a revolution. So there you see what you might call the popular element in Lenin, seeing real workers taking over their own governance. They don't need vanguards. They can basically do it on their own. Rosa, but that was, I would say, aberrant in Lenin, in my opinion. What makes Rosa, in my opinion, a really interesting figure is that from the beginning, she's very committed to the idea that workers need to learn how to reason. They need to learn how to analyze arguments. They need to learn how to weigh arguments when you hear from all sides. So she really believes in the vision of workers controlling their lives and their future. And she sees free speech as an absolute prerequisite if you're truly committed to the working class controlling their lives. I would say that's a rare element in that tradition. The tradition which climaxes in the Second International. I would say that was pretty rare, and she's a very impressive figure in that regard.
I just want to go back to your initial point, Ben, though, about what Marx might say on liberty, right? I think that I agree with Professor Finkelstein that, by and large, when Marx thought about ethical theory, he was reared in the tradition of Hegelian ethical theorizing, and that would be the model or template that he would take for doing that in an exemplary way. Right? A lot of people might remember that he wrote essentially a book-length critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and appreciated its social understanding and historical understanding of how ethics are embedded in institutions and come to constitute the ethical life of a community. And I think that he would see Mills's On Liberty as essentially a kind of work of speculation in the most negative sense of the world, right? Trans-historical, moralizing, potentially even utopian in its expectation that this is going to bring about a good society. But I also think that, to Ben's point, he would probably think that it was more or less harmless, right? It was agitating for something that was valuable. It's just not something that's going to be valuable to agitate for, because eventually the mode of production will elevate to a sufficient level that everyone's going to be granted the conditions to express themselves fully. But I do actually think that the essay is valuable seen from a different, more analytical perspective, as a great work, if you want, of analytical moral philosophy. I think beyond just the content of the book, which I by and large mostly agree with, although there are some controversies that we can get into later, I think that that book really makes two major innovations. One is develops what's sometimes referred to as a rights utility synthesis that has been pretty much the holy grail for a lot of people ever since. And this isn't my term. This is from Professor Shapiro at Yale, right? Because what Mill really does that's quite extraordinary in this book is show how to truly be a utilitarian in this progressive sense, you need to grant people an awful lot of personal liberty, and especially liberty of expression. And this might seem contrary to the spirit of utilitarianism, which just says, look, maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And if you need to compromise liberty to do that, then do so because it's expedient and utility maximizing. What Mill says is actually, by and large, people are the best judges about what makes them happy, precisely for the reasons that were mentioned before, because we're pretty idiosyncratic and a lot of us want to be eccentric. So you want to give people a lot of space to engage in experiments on living, and you also want to allow them to express themselves so that others can assess whether or not the experiment that they're running might be a useful thing for them, right? And I really think that this is a very powerful argument because it recognizes, to lean on a cliche here for a few seconds, the fundamental diversity between individuals in a way that classical thinkers like, say, Aristotle didn't always appreciate to the same degree, right? The second thing that I think the book does really successfully that's related to the first is Mill really inaugurates what we sometimes call the mature philosophy of Enlightenment liberalism, because he doesn't really rely a lot on a priorist modes of reasoning about what's moral and immoral, right and wrong. He really says that, look, we need to apply a fallibilistic method to this, and that can extend to our commitment to free speech, precisely because we can say, look, there are a lot of different lives that people might want to live, some of which might be better for them than others, and some of which might be good for some people and bad for others. But the only way we're going to be able to figure this out is to run as many experiments as possible and then share our findings, essentially, right? But to kind of a prioristically suss out what the right life for man qua man is, the way that some Thomistic thinkers or scholastic thinkers might want to, is just a fool's errand because we need to try it out in practice, right? And I think this fallibilistic approach that's going to go on to influence, I think, some less admirable people like Karl Popper, for example, who extends the idea quite widely, right? Still has quite a lot of gas in the tank, even if there are reasons that we should criticize it. So I think that the book is more innovative philosophically than sometimes has been appreciated by people who just look at it as a straightforward argument for free speech and free expression, right? It does some pretty innovative things. But like a lot of stuff with Mill, he wasn't really as gumptious about presenting his innovations as perhaps he should have been.
Well, I think there are several things I would want to comment on. First of all, I don't think, well, let me begin with the first one. The first point is Mill has two kinds of argument for individuality and for freedom of conduct. One kind of argument is one person's happiness might not be another person's happiness, and that each individual should be able to find what suits them, what suits their character. He said at one point, a person who doesn't have his own tastes and desires has no more character than a steam engine has character. So one thing is personal development. Each of us, Mill says, when we become more valuable to ourselves, we become more valuable to others. That, in other words, it's Marx's, the free development of each is the precondition for the free development of all. As we develop ourselves individually, we enhance society because each of us has a gift. Each of us has a talent. It may not be a gift or a talent on the order of Aristotle or Noam Chomsky, but we have a gift. We have something we can be good at. That I believe, I've come to believe that. And so if we're given, each of us, the opportunity to maximize our gift, we'll be maximizing society's benefits. You know, you can imagine a society in which each of those subway musicians was able to earn a real income, and each neighborhood would have its own band or orchestra. That's completely feasible. Each of those subway musicians, many of whom are very gifted, very talented, or even, subway, I'm talking about my own city, New York, subway platform, dancers, performers. If each of them can maximize his or her gift, and they have genuine gifts, about that I have no doubt, but in a reasonable society, every community, every neighborhood would have its own band, its own orchestra, and we would all benefit. So that's one kind of argument in Mill. The second
would go live in like a heavy metalville inevitably, right?
Say that again?
Ben would go live in like heavy metalville, wherever that happened to be.
I would.
And the second argument, he has a long passage on why societies like China, which had great civilizations, why they stagnated. And he said they stagnated. He has a long, nothing by Mill is trivial. It's like reading Chomsky. Chomsky is incapable of a trivial observation. On any tiny topic, whatever observation he makes, it was always the product of stupendous learnedness, And it was the same thing with Mill. So when he has this long passage about why China stagnated, and he finds one reason. He said because there wasn't individuality. He said they had very talented administrators, the Chinese, the Mandarin class. They are very talented administrators. So that couldn't be the reason. The problem was the lack of individuality. That's why these civilizations stagnated. So that's a second kind of argument for Mill. That in order for there to be social progress, there has to be tolerance and encouragement, not just tolerance. There has to be encouragement of individuality extending all the way to eccentricity. So that's the social benefit. There's the personal benefit. Each of us gets to realize our talents and our gifts. And then there's the social benefit, which is society will progress. But that's one kind of argument. I would say I disagree, not that it's a significant disagreement, it's just probably just terminological. There's a very big difference between Mill's experiments in living and his advocacy of liberty of speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Liberty of speech is very freewheeling. There's only one limitation in Mill to liberty of speech. Literally, there is only one. He allows for everything except the beginning of chapter 3. He has the famous example of the corn dealer who's surrounded by hungry peasants, and some person in the crowd starts shouting, "He's an exploiter, he's a bloodsucker," this or that. And Mill says that's where speech comes too close to conduct, and you have the right to suppress it. In fact, you could say the whole history of American jurisprudence on the right to free speech, what's the limit? And as you both know, the famous limit is the clear and present danger. The whole history of our jurisprudence over the 20th century, which is when it evolved, the right to freedom of speech, is simply an elaboration of that one paragraph at the beginning of chapter 3 about the corn dealer. At what point does speech come too close to conduct or imminent violence that you have the right to suppress it? When it comes to conduct itself, Mill sounds good. He sounds good, but there are a lot of limitations to what he actually allows. This whole issue. Let's take a simple question. Experiments in living. Okay, Mill advocates experiments in living, of course, with the caveat, unless it does harm to others. Okay, so where would Mill stand on lesbians adopting a child? Where would he stand?
I mean, presumably that would depend on what the empirical research just said about whether it caused harm. Right?
But let's say before empirical research, before it's been done, would he support it? I think that's a tough question.
So your speculation is that he would have thought, because it was a sort of common social prejudice that that this would have caused harm.
Yes. And Mill says there's no crime greater than bringing a child into the world if you're unprepared to raise that child. He calls that the greatest crime you can commit. So would he support that? My guess is no.
I think that inherently those cases are always penumbral, though. Right? I mean, I just wanted to stress that I think that your articulation of the kind of developmental ethic in Mill is very artfully said, right? And I also just want to kind of draw one more symmetry here, which is that when Mill describes human beings as being more than pigs that need to be satisfied, right? We're rather like living trees that need to extend and grow to our natural duration, and that we need to be provided with the resources to develop those fundamental capabilities. He's fundamentally making the same kind of argument that Marx is eventually going to make in Capital Volume 3 at the end, where he says that under capitalism, one of the great wrongs that are done to people is the fact that only a narrow band of our capacities are developed, those that are profitable, that's profitable for capital to develop. Right? Think about Smith's famous example of the pen maker, right? You get very good at making a small part of pens as according to the division of labor, but not very good at everything else, right? Marx says socialism will develop the full range of human powers as an end in itself. And I think that Mill would have a lot of sympathy with that, right? And I think that the commitment to experiments in living is part and parcel of this. But I think those, to your point, Professor Finkelstein, I think that's always going to be just inherently more controversial because there are so many actions that can be perceived to cause even physical harm in the pursuit of my experimental living. But the line gets penumbral, right? Just a good example that I bring up in my my constitutional law class is, back in the day when I was young, everyone could smoke indoors. You know what I mean? You could smoke indoors at the Tim Hortons. You could smoke indoors at the restaurants. You could smoke indoors in the house. My grandpa smoked all the time around me, and I ended up buying his brand of cigarettes when I inevitably turned to purchase them, right? Although I'm trying to quit now. Not very successfully, I should add, right? Nowadays, nobody allows for that anywhere. Even if you go to Mexico, where I lived for a long time, most places won't let you smoke. And that's because we've decided, well, yeah, you might not be physically causing harm to someone deliberately by smoking near them. But secondhand smoke is proven to have very serious negative effects on people. So we probably shouldn't allow that socially. And to your point about the earlier example, I think that if Mill were alive, here I am doing what I said we shouldn't do, speculating on what he'd say right now, he'd probably say this is a pretty rational policy to take. We probably shouldn't let people smoke allow secondhand smoke to pervade the atmosphere when you can just go outside and do your deed there, right? But I think that you really need to take this on a case-by-case basis. I'm really not sure there's a clear rule.
I'll make two comments on that. First of all, as Professor Chomsky famously said to me, only my enemies call me Professor Chomsky.
Oh, sorry.
It's enormous fun.
All right, well, that's what we'll do from now.
Okay. First of all, you say you have to take these things in a case-by-case basis, but that's the problem. You see, he doesn't provide any guidelines.
Yeah.
When you read actually chapter 5 of On Liberties called Applications, and in applications, he goes through all sorts of things, all sorts of possibilities, including things like, should prostitution be legalized? Should gambling halls be allowed? And the thing that struck me about Applications, chapter 5, I realized I could not have guessed any of his answers.
Yeah, I know, right? It's so weird.
It's like he gives you the principles, but then when he tries to translate the principles into practical examples, I couldn't have guessed any of them. To put it otherwise, the principles got you absolutely nowhere. They got you absolutely nowhere. He'll be all for liberty, but then at one point he says, there are certain offenses to public morals which should be banned. Well, once you go down that path, there's no stopping you. Offenses to public morals, what can't be banned under that title?
Yeah, he gets a famous example where it's like, many people find it disgusting to witness other human beings copulate in public, which, to be fair, would probably be a bit of a weird world. But like your point, it's like, well, if we're going to sit there and say, well, I feel disgusted by this, I don't want to see that, then that can apply to a whole range of things.
Right, exactly. The other thing is, I felt that Mill doesn't really deal, this is in connection with the point I just made, I don't really think he deals with the hard cases. Because let's give one example. Everybody, I think, understands there's a very thin line between eccentricity and pathology. How do you know a particular behavior is eccentric, which according to Mill should be encouraged, or it's pathological and it should be discouraged? So I always give the example at this point in class. Woody Allen marries his adopted daughter.
Oh, yeah.
Is that eccentricity and he should be praised that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time? Or is it pathology and it should be condemned?
Well, I don't know why I know this, but but technically she was not his adopted daughter. She was his long-term girlfriend's adopted daughter. They never lived in the same house. Still very crazy.
That just makes me feel so relieved, man. Oh my God, I just feel better about that now.
I know, now it's all fine.
As his son famously said, if you don't think there's a problem between being my father and being my brother-in-law, then you have a very big problem.
Okay, but Annie Hall is great. Anyway.
Yeah, it is. It's a good movie. And I also liked Blue Jasmine, but yeah, that's a hard thing to get past.
That's weird that that's the next one you go to. Like, that's the second bet. Anyway, whatever.
those
I do just wanna
Mill doesn't even address the question of pathology.
Yeah, right.
How can you write a paean to eccentricity and not notice there may be a problem here?
I think the closest he gets is when he talks, not just in On Liberty, but elsewhere, about things like public drunkenness, right, or excessive drinking, right? Because he wouldn't have had this terminology, but
no, he said public drunkenness is fine, just as long as you're not doing it on the job.
Oh, I know.
If you want to get drunk, that's your business, and you can lay in the street and vomit, and snooze in your vomit. What you can't do is, he said, if you're a sentry and a fort, you can't get drunk because then you can't perform your job.
Well, and I largely agree with that principle. But to your point about eccentricity,
Marx certainly would have agreed with at least the first half. At least as at least he was certainly a practitioner of public drunkenness.
I want to just say, Mill is so seductive. His prose is so compelling that you sometimes lose sight, I think, of basic issues. I think about one. I jog every day along the Coney Island seashore, right? And there is a restriction on the liberty of swimmers. They can only go out so far before the lifeguards call them in. Now, for Mill, that's nobody's business. As he says, quote, for your own good, says Mill, is not sufficient warrant to suppress your liberty. You can't say, I'm doing this for your own good. You can't do that. So the lifeguard wants to call in the swimmer for his own good because he might drown. Mill says, no, you can't restrict his right to swim for his own good. Okay? But then I say to myself, each time a person drowns, you have planes coming in searching for the body. I watch it because I see it often. You have lifeguard boats coming
Honestly,
in.
that's really chilling that happens often enough that you see it often.
Yeah, you do. You have lifeguard boats searching for the body. You have all the lifeguards. They go out en masse and they go under, up in unison, a straight line, trying to find the body. So you realize this principle of liberty, your own good is not sufficient warrant. Society pays a very heavy cost for it. It's a very heavy cost. It's a very heavy cost to allow people to smoke, because then it's the hospitals that have to come to their aid when they get lung cancer. And that's a very expensive proposition. So I find that even though Mill is very seductive in the way he phrases his argument, formulates and phrases his argument, his prose, his terrifying grasp of control over the English language, the moment you start thinking through a lot of these propositions, they're just much more complicated than he acknowledges.
Yeah. So I want to. So you said a couple of things there, and I think that so one of them, kind of at the beginning of all this, was about the difficulty in answering the hard cases based on the principle that, like, you sort of don't know from the principle where Mill's going to come down.
Exactly.
And I wonder, I mean, I certainly take your later point about about some of the, some of the tricky things about applying the harm principle. I mean, like, I suppose we could have a society where we don't want to, we don't, try to rescue, drown swimmers or find the bodies, and we don't treat people who got lung cancer from smoking. I certainly don't want to live in that society. But on the first point, I wonder if you might be able to partially defend Mill just by saying it might be okay that you don't know just from the principle where he's going to come on, where he's going to come down in some of these cases, because the principle, tells you, the principle tells you is a function from the empirical facts to what conclusion you should draw. And so it could be that in some of these cases, go back to the lesbian adoption case, that it might be hard to predict what he would have thought, because it might be hard to know what he would have assumed that the relevant factual claims were, right? So it could be like in that instance, for example, right? Like Mill could have come to the wrong conclusion because he could have had a mistaken factual belief, but I'm not sure.
Well, I don't think it's just factual belief, because
that's criticism of the principle per se, right?
Mill says, I'll be quick. Mill says that the experiments in living have to be proved practically. That in theory, I always use the example with my class. When I was growing up in the 60s, it was the beginning of the women's liberation, what was called back then, the women's liberation movement. And one of the main aspects of the women's liberation movement was women going to work. And with the idea of women going to work, the obvious question came up of what? What happens to the children? So how did we resolve that in our minds in the 1960s? We resolved in our minds that children didn't need so much quantity time, that they didn't need the mother around all the time. We said, we thought, we were told by the women's liberation movement that quality time was sufficient. Mommy comes back from work, daddy comes back from work, they have their dinner, and then they have a few quality hours with their child, and everything will be fine. So we substitute quality for quantity time. We also thought mommy was unfulfilled at home. Daddy was the only one feeling fulfillment. And once mommy was fulfilled, mommy will love daddy more, daddy will love mommy more, they will both be fulfilled, and their family will also be happy together. That's what we thought. So it was all a plus. There were no minuses. What happened in reality? In reality, first of all, a lot of kids didn't like it coming home and having a parent at home. Second of all, quality time in many cases didn't exist very much because both parents were professionals. And thirdly, now that mommy went to work, she didn't want to have to, the main reason people didn't get divorced because a woman was afraid of being left with nothing. Because that's how divorce worked back then. The woman was, her, as it's called, lifestyle dramatically fell, plummeted. And daddy, you know what daddy discovered? Now that she has her own job, it's no big deal if I divorce her. And so all of our theory proved, when it came to practically applying it in the experiments in living, proved to be wrong. It proved to be wrong. I'm not saying it's better to go back to the way it was, but one has to be honest about these things. Kids did feel a lack. I knew that generation.
I think this is an instance, though, where there are the theoretical resources in Mill's project to reconstruct it in such a way as to answer those kinds of difficulties, right? In particular, we could turn to the subjection of women, where he talks about the importance of things like marital friendship and child rearing extensively. And then we could complement that with all of his own socialist intuitions about the need to provision certain kind of basic goods for society. And amongst those basic goods, to secure the feminist objectives, I would include things like maternity leave and, of course, paternity leave. That would be expansively generous, far more than we'd have right now. So I think that that's definitely an issue that is very clearly pressing right now. But I think that the Mill outlook, if you want to call it that, has the kind of resources to address it specifically. But I just want to come back to something that Ben said about the material on how it is that this rule is meant to be applied. I think that some of the dissatisfaction comes in the fact that Mill quite proudly, uncharacteristically proudly in the book says, I just want to assert some very clear, very simple principles, which does lead one to assume, oh, that this is just going to be very, very clear in the application of it. And then in chapters 4 and 5, you're just like, I really don't feel that this is very clear at all. And honestly, to your point, I'm not sure you think it's really all that clear either, right? Now, I don't think that necessarily means the principle is defeated, because you could just say, qua Ben, well, look, we should still abide by something that looks like the harm principle, but we just have to apply it loosely as a kind of rule of thumb, and then evaluate things on a case-by-case basis, kind of like you were suggesting, Norm, when it comes to things like women getting a job for themselves, right? Versus, other kinds of alternatives. But there's something dissatisfying about this when we were promised this great, glorious, simple principle that you could apply almost mechanically to just resolve all these problems.
Yeah, because everything falls apart where it says, I have a very simple principle. He recites the principle. He tucks in, except when it causes harm to others.
Yeah, exactly. And as it turns out, that can mean an awful lot of things.
Who decides what harm is?
Yeah, precisely. And just to go back to the example about pathology, I mean, what I was thinking about is, Mill defends heavy drinking, right? Saying, you want to get drunk, you're only harming yourself, you should be allowed to do that. What'd you say, throw up in the street? And, I tend to agree with that. I have a pretty libertarian attitude around things like decriminalization of drugs. But you could also even say, well, what happens if you get addicted and then you decide to go get it behind a car? And we think that's a big
what happens
problem.
to the parents?
Yeah,
what happens to the family? I mean, he doesn't even, if your father is an alcoholic or your mother is an alcoholic, that ain't a pretty picture at home. If your father or mother is addicted to drugs, non-alcoholic drugs, it ain't a pretty picture.
Not at all. And this is why I think that the whole idea that this is a simple argument just really doesn't really convince a lot of us who end up living in a more morally complicated world where weird shit happens all the time. And you think like, well, harm needs to be understood a little bit more gradationally. Than just physical
the thing
harm.
is, Mill is like Chomsky and Russell. They had Chomsky is great. Chomsky is good. Let us thank him for our food. Okay, I said that. So now I'm allowed to criticize him a little. But this isn't really a criticism. It's an observation. The thing about Chomsky is he was not intentionally. Look, I know Chomsky's faults. He was my closest friend for 40 years. I know his faults, but not intentionally. Chomsky made all arguments very deceptive because he just says, here are the facts, here are the principles, here's the conclusion. Facts, principles, reason through, here's the conclusion. It was never that. There was a very significant step that he always omitted mentioning. I know your t-shirt might now fall apart then. The principle of the exercise.
I feel like I need a theme t-shirt, right? I feel like I'm almost the odd man out here. It's like, oh, I'm just wearing the blue shirt that I pulled out of the drawer.
Well, I have some t-shirts of me. Students made them. The faculty of judgment. You have the facts, you reason them through, but that doesn't yield the conclusion. It's the faculty of judgment that always intervenes. And Chomsky had, because he was steeped in Western philosophy and all philosophy, I'm not saying every philosophy, but obviously he knew Hebrew philosophy. He was well read across the board. As was Mill.
Big fan of continental philosophy, especially as I recall. He always expressed so much love and reverence for it.
Well, I mean, he's so didn't enjoy the Foucault and Derrida kind of continental philosophy, but he had actually Chomsky seemed very like.
Allow me just complete the thought.
Yeah.
The faculty of judgment always intervene between the facts and the reason and his conclusion. And he was what make him in many ways remarkable, besides his mastery of the factual base and his reasoning capacity, he had, if we can use the term, an exquisite faculty of judgment. Very rarely did I find his judgment off on personal or political issues. I found it rarely off. Same thing with Russell. When you read Russell on controversial issues of the day, whether it's homosexuality, premarital living together, all sorts of things, he was in a class all his own. He was very independent-minded, and history vindicated him on almost all of those issues. Mill, when you get to that chapter 5, applications, you know what's the most stunning thing about that chapter 5? Most of Western civilization came to accept his distinctions. So he comes out with, say, support for what we would now call red light districts, things like that. Almost, when you look at his arguments, they all carry the day, even though those arguments did not come inexorably from the facts and principles. They came from judgment. And they proved on balance. There are a couple of places where obviously history did not redeem him. He didn't think that there was an absolute right to marriage. He said marriage presumes children. And to bring children into the world where the parents aren't prepared to raise them, he says it's a crime. Rare case he uses that strong language, is a crime against that being, meaning the child. And so at the end of chapter 5 in applications, he says restricting the right of marriage to those who are capable of bringing a being in the world is legitimate. So there are places where I would say history didn't vindicate him, but in general, he did carry the day.
I'd like to bring up one more particularly relevant example, given the channel that we're on. In chapters on socialism, which was presented to me initially falsely as a kind of critique of socialism exclusively, it actually has some wonderful things, very laudatory things to say about it initially, right? He does have a very far-sighted bit of commentary where he suggests that the statist forms of socialism that assume that the state can just assume the economic function of the market are inherently dangerous, will lead to various forms of despotism, and the socialist movement would be better off just avoiding that. And then he gives his own alternatives, right? Now, I would be the first to admit that I think that a robust form of Millsian-style market socialism centered around just a cooperative economy, essentially, has never really been tried. So to be sufficiently Millsian, we can't really say whether it would be successful or not. But I think on the point about a command economic system backed by state authoritarianism, he's been proven very, very right that is not a viable route for socialism to go down, right? So I think his instincts proved pretty salient in a lot of those cases.
Bakunin made the same critique of Marx, the red intelligentsia.
Yeah.
That they would come to, in the Marxist vision, they would come to dominate society. And I remember Chomsky liked Bakunin, I don't know why. And he hated, of course, Lenin, and I never agreed with him on that. In fact, I told Chomsky, your style is exactly Lenin's style.
Really?
He writes exactly like Lenin. No rhetorical flourishes, no adverbs, no adjectives, totally committed to this reasoned argument, which proceeds like a juggernaut. That's Lenin. He wrote just like Lenin. I don't know if he liked or disliked that observation of mine. He had a very similar mind to Lenin. Lenin was not tolerant of critics because he had great confidence in his reasoning capacity. And it's the same thing with Professor Chomsky. His confidence in his reasoning capacity, obviously it was justified, but sometimes with Professor Chomsky, I know we're deviating. When he talks about critics, if you read him, he never ever says, never, he never says we disagree. You know what he always says? He doesn't understand my argument. He doesn't understand. In other words, if he understood my argument, he would have to agree with it. He never allowed for the possibility, you know what, Professor Chomsky, I perfectly understand your argument. I understand every single step in your argument, and you know what? I still disagree.
Well, that's to your point about the independent faculty of judgment being an extremely important feature of our moral architecture, really. But I don't want to weigh in on what Chomsky is like, right? I mean, I've liked his books since I started reading them. I also like the theory of generative grammar. I appreciate that there are a lot of problems for it, but great breakthrough. So we'll bracket that. I would say that in terms of Mills's personality, there's a bit of difference to what you just described, and I think this comes through in the biography most clearly, but also across his broader oeuvre. Because what I really admire about Mill, maybe there's a bit of appreciating that he was the OG on this, is he always would read people from very different ends of the political spectrum, and he was willing to accept their insights, but I think always in a way that recognized their limitations and moved them in the right direction politically. Just to give one example, he was very overt about the fact that he had a nervous breakdown quite young, because he just realized that even if he was able to implement Benthamite utilitarianism without any kind of limitations, it would not make him happy. And then he read Coleridge, Carlyle, a lot of reactionary critics of modernity and capitalism, and said, I kind of learned how to be sensitive again and be emotional again. Quite a breakthrough moment for him. Now, if you had read that story just up to there in the biography, you might think, oh, by the way, he's definitely going to become a conservative. Like, that's the trajectory he's on. I was once a naive Benthamite progressive, and now I am a conservative reactionary critic of modernity. But what Mills does is actually say they are absolutely right that there's this cruel, callous quality to bourgeois liberalism. And so we are going to not abandon bourgeois liberalism, but we are going to better it, right? We're going to take these insights about the alienation that appears under capitalism and move towards socialism. And I think that displays a real analytical power in being able to draw creative insights from very different traditions while still moving in the right direction politically and morally consistently over the course of his life. Again, a few mistakes here and there. So that's what I just really admire about him. He always read people seriously. He always learned what there was to learn from them if they were intelligent and thoughtful. But he never gave up his own independent powers of evaluation and made sure to incorporate those insights into a much more attractive overall picture.
He also gave credit to Rousseau.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Rousseau is kind of he's the antithesis of Western civilization. And he says he called them like firecrackers or something. When Rousseau,
I didn't know that. That's cool.
When Rousseau came on the scene. But I don't think he mentions, he mentions him by name. But it was clear that he recognized that Rousseau did have insights, but he thought that, I think he saw them as discrete insights, but in a worldview which was not realistic. Because so did Rousseau. They both saw the trajectory of where things are going. And Mill thought on balance it's good. Rousseau, I think, thought on balance it was not good. In my old age, I have become more attracted to Rousseau. I think the technology thing is completely out of control. I don't own an iPhone. I've never used an ATM. I would say God's worst invention by far is the phone menu.
Really?
Yeah, I consider it worse than intercontinental ballistic missiles.
I mean, I'm with you there. It is immensely frustrated that all these restaurants used the pandemic as the excuse to stop doing paper menus, even though we found out like 3 weeks into the pandemic that surfaces weren't very important. But
now was the professor the horror of AI. for any professor who wants to assign the paper. It's become a tragedy.
Oh, no. I am, it's funny. I'm generally somebody who, I'm generally enthusiastic about technological progress for more or less orthodox Marxist reasons. But generative AI actually makes me a Luddite because I think it's because I think that
it's a profoundly inhumane thing.
It's potentially
it's soulless.
It's an extinction level event for higher education. I don't know how
soul has been extirpated. I'm coming out with a new book. I shouldn't say anything negative about the book, but we were struggling with a cover, and I laid down a law. I do not want a cover generated by AI because it's inhuman. It's inhuman. The soul has been extirpated.
Absolutely.
So these sorts of things.
This is where we all go reactionary on the show immediately, right? Take the Colorado Coleridge rule.
Robbie, to answer your question, of course I have. Everybody who assigns papers has had papers written by AI turned into them.
Do you know what horror it turned into? The whole thing, I have to say, as a teacher, was this past semester.
Oh, yeah. Horrible.
How many wars I had with students, and it created a new aspect of animus and acrimony in the class. I had to sit down one after another students, go through it line by line. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And the students were, at least some, were confident they could brazen it out. And I would not relent. I have still pending in the fall, assuming my job is not eliminated. I have 3 students who I still have to engage in war with over this issue of who wrote the paper. So I never had that. When people plagiarized, it was so obvious in the past.
Oh, yeah.
And secondly, you can always...
I had somebody send in something that I had written before, and I was like, oh, gosh.
Amazing.
I know we have to end, so Jason Miles, I just want to say I don't want to disappoint you. I will stop talking.
But
you can always tailor a question narrowly enough that there would be no possibility of plagiarism. But now you can tailor a question so narrowly, and AI will produce a very competent reply.
It's genuinely awful. I mean, we were talking about the harm principle earlier, and Mill's difficulty in applying it. Which, by the way, I meant to say this earlier. I would ultimately, I was kind of running this half defense of him earlier. I'd ultimately argue. What I've said in other places. I actually wrote an essay about this last year called John Stuart Mill on justice and utility. And, basically what I argue there is that I think his best and most interesting instincts sort of go beyond his simple utilitarianism that he was officially committed to, and that ultimately what he's grappling with is, I think, in order to properly apply some of the stuff, you have to just admit you're weighing entirely different values against each other. But in any case, that's a larger discussion.
That's what judgment is. Judgment is the faculty of weighing.
Yeah.
As Russell says, Bertrand Russell says at one point, on any significant argument, there are always arguments on both sides. I teach Supreme Court law. I actually think Plessy versus Ferguson was a well-argued case. I think the worst case ever argued in Supreme Court history is Brown versus Board of Ed. There's no arguments, just like an administrative decree. But in any question I teach a Supreme Court course on.
Thank God for bad jurisprudence then.
On race, sex, and privacy. The landmark Supreme Court cases in race, sex, and privacy. And in fact, by the end of the course, everybody is convinced, you know what, on things where I'm absolutely have a strong opinion, like abortion or gay marriage or what was called back then same-sex sodomy. There are arguments on the other side. There are always arguments on the other side. And that's where the faculty of judgment is basically the faculty of weighing. You have arguments on both sides, and then where do you come down with those arguments? That's what judgment is. Judgment, what distinguishes judgment from reason is, as Professor Chomsky liked to tell me, abstract principles just don't get you very far. Because in the real world, principles clash. So his classic example, at least to me, was it's wrong to lie, obviously. But if a rapist knocks on your door and says, is your daughter in the bedroom?
Yeah, right.
Well, there's a clash of principles.
Not if you can't.
What?
Yeah,
Not if you can't.
Kant famously bites the bullet on this. But yeah, this is line is line is line. But okay, this has been fascinating, which is one reason we've let it run.
And you know what? It was very substantive. I'm not as knowledgeable as Matt. I never have no problem admitting my limitations. But
It's a real pleasure, though. I mean, we've never met before, but I really enjoyed this conversation. I just want to say.
yeah, I wish we had more time. You know, the one part of the conversation we never got to really was Mill on freedom of speech.
I know.
Yeah.
Right?
I had a whole bunch of things ready just for that.
Yeah.
That was kind of, well, you know what, guys, this is not an unsolvable problem. You know what we could do is start an email thread and find a date that we can do one that's just purely on that. So in fact,
if you have Matt, if you have there's a new edition of my book. You're holding up the old edition. There's a new edition which I'll just show you.
Oh boy.
Nice, yeah, that's my this is the
First edition.
yeah, this is what, you know, I think before I had you on the first time, you know, your handlers, you know, sent me this. So
Well, now it's the second edition, and it's rapidly approaching a lethal weapon. If I drop it from the 6th floor, if you're below on the sidewalk, you probably won't survive. In any case, in it, I have a long chapter on Holocaust denial and trying to apply Mill's principles.
yeah, well, I actually read the part in the first edition. There's like 6 pages on Mill and Holocaust denial to prepare for this. And yeah, this is definitely, yeah, let's get into it. I want to do the full devoted free speech conversation. So we will absolutely put a follow-up on the books. We'll figure out a good time that works for the three of us to do that. But
and one other thing, I did a public presentation with Cornel West and former president of the ACLU, Nadine Strassen, on cancel culture, free speech, and Gaza.
Yeah.
And we clashed on this issue, which Mill doesn't address.
I wasn't aware you had strong feelings about that.
About what?
He's joking.
Yeah, I'm joking. Just never mind.
Wait, strong feelings about what?
That cluster
Israel,
of subjects
Palestine.
you just mentioned, you know, that's
About what?
he said Israel Palestine, you know, the
Oh.
yeah.
I was just being very sarcastic. I'm sorry.
Right. But we clashed on the question of whether war criminals have the right to free speech. And it went on for quite a long time. And I was the dissenter there. I strongly believe in respecting the dead. And I consider allowing a war criminal to speak to be a desecration of the memory of the dead. And Cornell and Nadine and I, we went on at some length on this particular question. So maybe in the future,
Yeah, I'm actually. I think I'm actually on the West, Nadine side of that. So that'd be an interesting thing to get into in the follow-up episode on free speech. I am going to use my dictatorial power on this show to clamp down on discussion because we're a full half hour over. I know. I know, Matt, you had one other thing you wanted to say, so let's keep it very fast, and then we'll.
Oh no, it was a very elaborate thing about the difference between Ayn Rand and John Stuart Mill, and why one is good liberal and the other is a terrible libertarian. But we'll bracket that for later.
Okay, we'll fold it.
Who and John Stuart Mill?
Ayn Rand, like what Ayn Rand means by liberty and what John Stuart Mill does. Okay, that's interesting. We'll get to it. I swear, I take this oath that we will do a follow-up episode on purely dedicated to free speech. But right now, guys, this is so good. This is I wanted to bring the two of you together because I thought that would just be a really interesting, crossing the stream, see what that looked like, and this was fantastic. I love this. So yeah. We will do that follow up. The patron stream with Jason. We'll start that right now. So if you are a patron, you should have that link. But thank both of you. Yeah, I know. I wish it didn't have to end. So
no, I haven't eaten a meal yet today.
Yeah. You gotta let Norm have dinner. That's it's 10:30 in his time zone. So,
Matt, what is your last name?
McManus, most Irish name in the world. So it's Matthew McManus at Spelman College right now, teaching political theory, or at least I will be in 2 weeks, making the move there.
You're at Spelman?
Mm-hmm.
Lucky you. They wouldn't hire me.
I'm really sorry about that. Well, that's their error, I will say.
Just as an adjunct, I remember Alice Walker is a friend of mine, and she went to Spelman, and she spoke to the president, and they wouldn't hire me. I wanted to teach at one of the historically black colleges and universities.
I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, let's. I wonder if my former colleagues at Morehouse would. No,
I don't think so, because I know this is going to sound bigoted, but Jewish liberals have a lot of say there, and I'm just a red flag to a bull.
Interesting.
Well, they won't do it because of that.
Yeah. Well,
that's their endowments. Harvard and Columbia and all the others discovered that belatedly.
Yeah.
But that was always a problem with the HBCUs. HBCUs.
HBCUs.
It was liberal Jews who supplied a lot of the money, like with the NAACP. So when I came along and I was looking for work, I applied to all of the HBCUs, and they wouldn't even give me an interview. Believe it or not, I even volunteered to teach for free, and they wouldn't take me.
Yeah. Well, I think that when we do start the free speech episode, I think maybe those personal experiences.
It's over, but
kicking off point for discussion. But
I certainly would have enjoyed that experience.
Ben is trying to censor us to indicate.
I am trying mightily to censor everybody because
so nice to talk to both of you.
Absolutely. It is always a pleasure, Norm.
Yeah.
Go. We will do this again soon. Go have something to eat.
Yeah. Thank you.
And left is best.
And Matt,